Hello, and welcome to the Lawn Chair Philosophy Foundation's fifth installment of its Continental Shop Series, wherein we discuss fundamental notions around which conversations in the Continental tradition revolve. Last session, we discussed the notion of being from the perspectives of Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, and Fanon. And we all agreed that just one session on the notion of being would not suffice. So we decided to include more voices over this matter. We reached out to you, our community, to get a sense for which voices to include. And this is the list we received: Merleau-Ponty, Deleuze, and Nancy. We also received Badu, but at the last second, our presenter was called into work. So we will have to save that presentation for a later date, but we'll put a pin on that. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and start with our good friend Spore. We'll present on Merleau-Ponty, then we'll move on to Deleuze and Nancy, presented by our good friend Donovan Irven of Filo, Sofi Arts, and Analecta Hermenutica, and our most recent Buddhism mini course. So thank you all for joining. I will yield the floor to Spore. Go right ahead.
Thank you. So I've been asked to present on being as it appears in the works of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, or rather, I volunteered to speak 24 hours ago when I heard that Kelly was looking for a Merleau-Ponty scholar for today's presentation. I am not a Merleau-Ponty scholar. I run an Instagram account which pairs passages from Merleau-Ponty's works with pictures of hamsters. And so I was somewhat surprised at myself when I emailed Kelly to offer to present if no one else could. And I was even more surprised when Kelly accepted my offer. I feel wholly unprepared to speak to you today about the concept of being in Merleau-Ponty's philosophy. What can I say about a concept which appears everywhere and nowhere in the history of philosophy, which is so all-encompassing and yet so vague as to seem, on the face of it, almost meaningless? So as I got off the phone with Kelly yesterday at 4 p.m. and I sat down at my computer to draft this presentation, I felt that I almost understood for the first time Hegel's equation in the science of logic of being with nothingness. What can I say in the face of this abyss which demands my response? Well, I think we can begin by turning to one of Merleau-Ponty's last works, the unfinished manuscript tentatively titled The Origin of Truth, and posthumously published as The Visible and the Invisible. In a passage in which Merleau-Ponty introduces the concept of philosophical interrogation, he writes, in a particularly Heideggerian vein, that the question, what is being, becomes a properly philosophical question only when it attains, quote, a sort of diplopia, or double vision, by simultaneously aiming to delimit a state of things while also aiming to delimit its own being as a question. Philosophical inquiry, insofar as it aims to be reflexive, is the art of asking questions which return to themselves, which ask what it is to question and what it is to respond. If an inquiry into being is to be truly philosophical, then one cannot ask a question of being without also asking about the being of one's questioning. Recall that Heidegger, in Being and Time, identifies the question of being as the one question which philosophers throughout history had not yet posed. The fact that one can pose the question of being indicates that one has had a prior contact with being. And this is because questions, insofar as they are motivated by a desire to learn something more about their object of inquiry, presuppose that at least some understanding of what it is that they're after, however inchoate that might be. When one asks the question, what is being, one may not know exactly what being is, but one knows that it is, that it exists, that it is there. But being is not simply the sort of thing we can point to. It's not really a thing at all. Being as such, to use Heidegger's language, Sein, is ontologically distinct from the existence of individual entities like tables or chairs. Individual entities, which Heidegger designates with the word Seiende, have an ontic existence. They have certain properties and instantiate certain relationships amongst themselves, which are amenable to empirical investigation by the natural and social sciences. We can learn about tables and chairs through the study of physics, or perhaps material anthropology, or even linguistics. And yet the knowledge we gain from these ontic disciplines, which study things, does not touch upon being in its ontological sense, or being as such, sein. Ontological inquiry is only afforded to Dasein, or human being, in its ontological sense, since Dasein is the one who asks the question of being. Thus, Heidegger, in Being and Time, attempts to answer the question of being by undertaking an existential analytic of Dasein, the being for whom being is a question. By studying Dasein in its everyday, pre-reflective engagement with the world, what Heidegger calls our being in the world, he hopes to help us remember our pre-theoretical contact with being, which previous philosophers have forgotten. Philosophy, writes Merleau-Ponty, is a reminding of this being. Elsewhere he writes, philosophy is this theory that discloses the pre-theoretical. Now, we'll return later to examine more closely this relationship between philosophy as a theoretical activity and the pre-theoretical being which it discloses. But first, it will be helpful to examine the ways in which Merleau-Ponty's focus on the perceiving body as the locus of one's being in the world supplements Heidegger's existential analytic Dasein in Being and Time. For Merleau-Ponty, quote, the body is the vehicle of our being in the world. Again, the body is our general medium for having a world. We have with our body, our senses, our look, measurements for being. In other words, the sensory motor structures of one's perceiving body provide the condition of possibility for there to be things at all. Quote, as a system of motor powers or perceptual powers, our corporeal schema constitutes a diacritical system which establishes internal relationships amongst different sensory modalities to produce a natural symbolism, which provides us with the, quote, keystone of the world. Quote, my body is precisely a ready-made system of equivalences and intersensory transpositions through which things come to be for me at all. The perceived unity of worldly things is accomplished by my body's synthetic intertwining of different sensory modalities, taste, touch, sight, smell, hearing, and kinesthesia. Notably, it is my body itself which accomplishes the synthetic constitution of the world I experience. Quote, the senses communicate amongst themselves. They translate each other without the need for an interpreter. They understand each other without having to pass through the idea. I'll quote an extended passage from the Phenomenology of Perception. In my body, visual and auditory experience, for example, are pregnant with each other, and their expressive value grounds the pre-predicative unity of the perceived world. In the movement of the branch from which a bird has just left, we read its flexibility and its elasticity, and this is how the branch of an apple tree and the branch of a birch are immediately distinguished. We see the weight of a block of cast iron that sinks into the sand, the fluidity of the water and the viscosity of the syrup. Likewise, I hear the hardness and the unevenness of the cobblestones in the sound of a car, and we are right to speak of a soft, dull, or dry sound. My body is the common texture of all objects, and is, at least with regard to the perceived world, the general instrument of my understanding. Note Merleau-Ponty's insistence that the perceptual synthesis which my body accomplishes occurs without the intervention of conscious thought. When I am absorbed in the activity of constructing a chair or a table for myself, and I look at my hammer to prepare myself to reach for it, I do not have to unite the sensible manifold which is given to me with the concept hammer. Quote, I do not think in the act of perception. Things organize themselves in front of me. Resting upon the pre-logical unity of the body schema, the perceptual synthesis appears to be carried out on the object itself, in the world, and not within the metaphysical point that is the thinking subject. Nor do I have to consciously locate the position of my hand in space in order to move it towards the hammer. Instead, my hand is called by the hammer to hold it in a certain way, and I find that as I wrap my fingers around its handle, quote, my body catches and understands the movement. Knowing how to reach for and grasp a hammer is a particular kind of knowledge in action, a, quote, knowledge of the hands, which is really, quote, not a knowledge at all, but a sliding awareness, the feeling of a power of a being able to, an I can, and not an I think, a manner of reaching the world and the object, a praktagnosia or practical knowledge, that must be recognized as original and perhaps originary. My body has its world or understands its world without having to go through representations or without being subordinated to a symbolic or objectifying function. Merleau-Ponty labels this form of intentionality which my body establishes between itself and things as a motor intentionality, which is again, quote, a relation of being and not of knowledge. So we should get the sense that the way in which my body constitutes the world by establishing a diacritical structure which links together different sensory motor capacities in an internal pre-logical unity occurs through a constant contact with being, which unfolds outside of, prior to, or beneath my reflective awareness. After a while of reaching for my hammer and putting it back down again, I can find myself reaching for my hammer without consciously intending to, either in thought or in action. Another passage from the Phenomenology of Perception. Quote, we discover beneath intelligence and beneath perception a more fundamental function. The core function we are speaking of here, prior to making us see or know objects, first more secretly brings them into existence for us. The life of consciousness, epistemic life, the life of desire, or perceptual life, is underpinned by an intentional arc that projects around us our past, our future, our human milieu, our physical situation, or rather, that ensures that we are situated within all of these relationships. This intentional arc creates the unity of the senses with intelligence, and the unity of sensitivity and motricity. In short, quote, the body schema is not perceived. It is the norm or privileged position in contrast to which the perceived body is defined. It is prior to explicit perception. The intentional arc which underpins my consciousness establishes the transcendental structures of space and time through which the world comes to be constituted as a world for me. But no matter how I try, the body schema's constituting activity remains unperceived. I cannot install myself at the genesis of those acts by which my body constitutes space and time. Instead, I find myself in a world which my body has already constituted, in which I am already oriented according to universal spatio-temporal dimensions, such as up and down, left and right, here and there, then and now. These dimensions mark the limit of what I can claim as the product of my conscious constitutions. Quote, we may say of these pre-givens either that they are always already constituted for us or that they are never completely constituted. In short, that consciousness is always behind or ahead of them, never contemporaneous. The analytic of consciousness always comes too late, after. The world is always pre-constituted, pre-given, self-evident. Quote, and that means perception is unconsciousness. What is the unconscious? What functions as a pivot, an existential, and in this sense is and is not perceived. Crucially, my consciousness of my body's pre-conscious world-constituting activity is negative. I become conscious of my inability to install myself at the genesis of its activity at the level of pre-conscious or unconsciousness. Bodily constitution marks a limit beyond which my conscious awareness can go no further. The synthetic acts of motor intentionality, which compose any given act of perception, unfold within a dimension of the world which I can neither consciously witness nor partake in. I can only acknowledge the factical existence of what I perceive. By virtue of its practical action in the world, my body has already established for me the constitution of a spatio-temporal world in which I find myself. The constitution of space and time, however, occur pre-consciously within a sort of pre-space and pre-time, which Merleau-Ponty calls a, quote, mythical time, a, quote, time before time, a time of sleep, of dreams, or again, quote, an original past, a past that has never been present. This pre-personal and anonymous temporality which haunts my conscious presence in the world is a function of my body's pre-conscious world-constituting activity. Another extended quote. There is another subject beneath me, for whom a world exists before I am there, and who marks out my place in that world. This captive or natural mind is my body, not the momentary body that is the instrument of my personal choices and that focuses upon some world, but rather the system of anonymous functions that wraps each particular focusing into a general project. And this blind adhesion to the world, this prejudice in favor of being, does not merely occur at the beginning of my life. It gives every subsequent perception its sense, and it is started over at each moment. At the core of the subject, space and perception in general mark the fact of their birth, the perpetual contribution of their corporeality, and a communication with the world more ancient than thought. And this is why they saturate consciousness and are opaque to reflection. Insofar as my body's constituting acts precede, exceed, and give birth to my conscious life, I find myself enveloped, surrounded by the rhythms of an anonymous life which I did not choose. This anterior temporality, which inhabits each moment of my temporality, this bodily activity to which my consciousness is passive, this unconsciousness which constitutes the core of my consciousness, is precisely the pre-personal anonymous life of my body. Merleau-Ponty writes that, quote, every sensation is a birth and a death. The subject who experiences it begins and ends with it, and since he can neither precede himself nor survive himself, sensation necessarily appears to itself in a milieu of generality. It arrives from beneath myself, and it results from a sensitivity that preceded it and that will survive it, just as my birth or my death belongs to an anonymous natality or mortality. I grasp through sensation on the margins of my personal life and of my own acts, a given life of consciousness from which these later determinations emerge, the life of my eyes, hands, and ears, which are so many natural selves. Each time that I experience a sensation, I experience that it does not concern my own being, the one for which I am responsible and upon which I decide, but rather another self that has already sided with the world, that is already open to certain of its aspects and synchronized with them. Between my sensation and myself, there is always the thickness of an originary acquisition that prevents my experience from being clear for itself. I experience sensation as a modality of general existence, already destined to a physical world which flows through me without my being its author. Here, we seem to reach a limit to the phenomenological inquiry into the nature of being. If phenomenology is the attempt to intuit the transcendental conditions of the world's appearance in our everyday life, and if the transcendental conditions of the world's appearance are precisely the pre-personal acts of my bodily constitution, of which I am unable to bring to consciousness, then I can, at best, only indicate this negative kernel at the heart of my consciousness, which orients me within a sensible world, and at the same time deprives me of an absolute knowledge of this world. Must we then admit the transcendental reduction's failure to enclose the world within the immanent sphere of consciousness indicates the failure of the phenomenological project itself? On the contrary, Merleau-Ponty insists that phenomenology begins precisely from the failure of the transcendental reduction. The reduction's failure is not really a failure at all. It is its success, insofar as the incompleteness of the reduction successfully reveals that being transcends its appearance to my consciousness. Quote, the incompleteness of the reduction is not an obstacle to the reduction. It is the reduction itself, the rediscovery of vertical being. Another quote, the reduction no longer involves a return to ideal being, but brings us back to an interweaving of horizons, to an open being. And another quote, what resists phenomenology within us, natural being, cannot remain outside of phenomenology and should have its place within it. In an essay which attempts to draw out the, quote, unthought elements on the margins of Husserl's phenomenology, Merleau-Ponty writes that the reduction reveals that the sensible world is a, quote, wild being. Here's an extended quote. Originally a project to gain intellectual possession of the world, constitution becomes increasingly, as Husserl's thought matures, a means of unveiling a backside of things that we have not constituted. This senseless effort to submit everything to the properties of consciousness was necessary. The picture of a well-behaved world left to us by classical philosophy had to be pushed to the limit in order to reveal all that was left over. These beings, beneath our idealizations and objectifications, which secretly nourish them, and in which we have difficulty recognizing noema. Willy-nilly, against his plans, and according to his essential audacity, Husserl awakens a wild flowering world and mind. Here's another quote from The Visible and the Invisible. The sensible is precisely that medium in which there can be being without it having to be posited. The silent persuasion of the sensible is being's unique way of manifesting itself without becoming positivity, without ceasing to be ambiguous and transcendent. Not precisely qua sensible given except by illusion. The sensible is that, this possibility to be evident in silence, to be understood implicitly, and the alleged positivity of the sensible world, when one scrutinizes it unto its roots, when one discloses the being of nature, precisely proves to be ungraspable. Here is the common tissue of which we are made, the wild being, and the perception of this perception, the phenomenological reflection, is the inventory of this originating departure whose documents we carry in ourselves. The essential is to describe the vertical or wild being as that pre-spiritual milieu without which nothing is thinkable, not even the spirit, and by which we pass into one another and into ourselves in order to have our own time. So we can see that the sensible world, as wild being, is the abyssal ground of consciousness. Wild being gives birth to our consciousness. Consciousness emerges from the sensible, and consciousness seeks to discover its own roots in being. When it does so, it returns to the sensible in order to think. But what it finds is something which exceeds thought. This may seem to pose a serious problem for phenomenology as a reflective enterprise, insofar as phenomenologists attempt to consciously reflect on their unreflected past, their participation in sensible being, insofar as they attempt to put into words a contact with being which is pre-predicative, pre-conceptual, silent. Merleau-Ponty writes, all of speculation is necessary in order to discover a sense for this pre-speculative being. But what will we say about it? Everything we will say about it will be in principle false. Silence? The philosopher speaks, but this is a weakness in him, and an inexplicable weakness. He should keep silent, coincide in silence, and rejoin in being a philosophy that is there ready-made. But yet everything comes to pass as though he wished to put into words a certain silence he hearkens to within himself. His entire work is this absurd effort. He wrote in order to state his contact with being. He did not state it and could not state it, since it is silence. Then he recommences. Hence my anxiety about speaking to you today about being, and hence my absurd decision to proceed in the face of my anxiety. How does one give voice to the mute being of the sensible qua sensible? What is it to speak, to think according to this silent and preconceptual wilderness? How might our thought, our language, not only tarry with the sensible, with the unthought, but carry its inchoate meaning into its own realm? To speak of this silent being is already to miss it, since being is precisely the silence from which our speech emerges and into which our speech falls. Every attempt to capture being in language only testifies to its power of escape, its transcendence. But is this really a problem? Are we not once again discovering that our failure, our inadequacy to give voice to being, is precisely the guarantor of its success, insofar as it reveals being itself as transcendence? Quote, if we rid our minds of the idea that our language is the translation or cipher of an original text, we shall see that the idea of a complete expression is nonsensical. and that all language is indirect or elusive, that is, if you wish, silence. Or again, if our utterances about being fail to reduce being to the immanence of being thought and being spoken, perhaps this failure succeeds in preserving being in its silent presence. To speak truthfully of being, then, would be to consciously acknowledge that the words one uses are inadequate, and that precisely because of their inadequacy, they really do achieve an adequation. They really do give voice to the silence of being. To quote from The Visible and the Invisible, it is the error of semantic philosophies to close up language as if it spoke only of itself. Language lives only from silence. Everything we cast to others has germinated in this great mute land, which we never leave. Born at this depth, language is not a mask over being, but, if one knows how to grasp it with all its roots and foliation, the most valuable witness to being. Philosophy itself is language, rests on language, but this does not disqualify it from speaking of language, nor from speaking of the pre-language and of the mute world, which doubles them. On the contrary, philosophy is an operative language, that language that can be known only from within, through its exercise, is open upon the things, called forth by the voices of silence, and continues an effort of articulation, which is the being of every being. Philosophy, precisely as being speaking within us, expression of the mute experience by itself, is creation, a creation that is at the same time a reintegration of being, for it knows itself to be a creation and wishes to surpass itself as pure creation, to find again its origin. It is, hence, a creation in a radical sense, a creation that is at the same time an adequation, the only way to obtain an adequation. Being is what requires creation of us for us to experience it. We have moved here from a phenomenology of perception to an ontology of being, albeit an indirect ontology. The attempt of philosophers to speak or to think about sensible being does not instantiate a rupture with being, nor does it necessitate a negation of being. Rather, philosophy continues being's own project of self-transcendence. Insofar as philosophers enjoy a preconceptual access to being through the vehicle of their living and perceiving bodies, a contact with being which is older than thought, being comes to realize itself through the activity of philosophers as they attempt to speak and think about this silent being. Hence, philosophy is being speaking within us. Quote, there is no longer consciousness, projections in itself or object. There are fields in intersection, in a field of fields. We are moments of the open field, which is sense in genesis, emerging once and for all. Thank you.
Oh, Spore. I have a tendency to just just jump in and steamroll, and I've been good about not doing that. But I'm speaking first. I have things to say. Number one, as a Husserl person, I so enjoy Merleau-Ponty's critique of him. So kind, and I could feel the love. Number two, after this presentation, Spore, you are no longer allowed to be surprised when people invite you to come speak. That was fantastic. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And actual question about the presentation. I am very fascinated by this concept of natural symbolism. And I'm wondering if the sort of natural symbolism that the body, I don't want to say possesses, but that occasions, can music be a vehicle to potentially, in an authentic way, articulate for us these silent voices, especially since music incorporates silence in significant ways? Or would Merleau-Ponty say, no, it's silence and that's what it is. Being needs its privacy, and there's just no tapping into that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll attempt to answer as best I can. Merleau-Ponty does not exclusively make philosophy like the sole arbiter of being. He is actually very interested in turning towards artists, painters and musicians especially, but also writers, Proust, Joyce, people who make poetry, right, who create something, right? Because philosophy is the creation of being, or being creating itself within us. It shares that with the arts, and the arts express being in a sense which is different from the language of philosophy, but certainly they express still a language of being. It is akin to what Merleau-Ponty calls a pre-language of being, which he identifies as he calls perception itself a kind of silent language. And so perception, insofar as it's already diacritical, right? It combines a multiplicity of senses and unifies them within the structure of our body. It has the same diacritical structure of language, which Merleau-Ponty is borrowing from the structural linguist Ferdinand Saussure. Now he identifies kind of the trademarks of certain painters or musicians, right? They're little flourishes which they can be known for as themselves constituting this pre-language. I think like Deleuze and Guattari would, for example, call this a territory or a territorialization of being.
Husserl might call it a style. Would he say like a musician's style is their own original embodiment of that language? Do you think that's a fair maybe comparison?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, Merleau-Ponty uses the same term, style.
Okay. Yeah, I love that. Okay. Sorry for being selfish, everyone. I yield the floor to other questions and comments.
So I wanted to ask about, I'm really, by the way, thank you for this really extraordinary presentation. I wanted to ask about your view of Merleau-Ponty in film. I'm sure you know he wrote an essay on film. And what your presentation immediately called to mind for me was the idea of framing. And in particular, I'm concerned with the relationship of on-screen to off-screen space. The fact that when you draw a frame, you immediately cut out something that you're aware of, in a sense, ahead of time. So that's one question I have. The other is just a remark about Thoreau, because Thoreau is obsessed with the horizon line. In Walden, for instance, he immediately talks about standing on his tiptoes to see something that is at the very edge of the horizon, even as he kind of sits still, in his seat, so to speak, in his little house next to Walden Pond.
Yeah, thank you. So as far as Merleau-Ponty's writings on film, my knowledge of them is scarce, and from what I can remember, he pays attention to film as a more realistic mode of art than, say, painting, and I think he may ignore it on that grounds. So in a passage from Eye and Mind, he mentions this famous photograph of a horse, which was taken as the horse was running, and the photograph captured the horse's like four legs in a certain position, which indicates running. And he compares that to this sculpture by Rodin, in which the movement, the position of the body which Rodin has sculpted is not anatomical. It's like not anatomically possible to achieve this position. And yet he says that the sculpture which Rodin has created, by virtue of its being not realistic, actually much more closely conveys this form of movement than the realism of film and photography. Now, I think that was to Merleau-Ponty's detriment, that he did not more closely engage with film as a properly artistic medium. Insofar as what you said about the camera framing what is on screen and what is off screen, yeah, I'm not sure what Merleau-Ponty might have to say about that, except like possibly that in the framing, the border which is created by the frame of the camera, we might be able to imagine the world as it extends beyond that border. And that imagination is not an activity of our minds, but is what he calls a kind of dreaming of being, this onirism of being itself. And yes, I love Thoreau as well. Yeah, the transcendentalists share much in common with phenomenologists.
So I would add to that that comment you just made about framing, which is really nice, that there is something in film called mise en scène, which is this very, very important term, which means it comes from the theater, where it means the setting of the stage. But once you get to moving images, which somehow are supposed to capture the act of perception, or do actually ahead of time capture the act of perception, it means the setting for the point of view of the spectator, the ultimate kind of point of view, not just a point of view in narrative terms or dramatic terms, but another kind of point of view that's implied. And that term, mise en scène, as it's used in film, has never really been adequately dealt with. It's just this absolutely important but absolutely slippery term. And I think that somehow that ties in with what you're talking about when you're talking about the precognition or pre-understanding of perception. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I would say as well, it might tie into Merleau-Ponty's later notion of the flesh of the world as being this relationship, this structure which obtains between my body and things, by virtue of which the sight from which I see is ensconced by being, enveloped within being, and my view of things, insofar as I have a perspective on them within space, a limited perspective, because I am myself the thing, reflects back to me implicitly the position of my own body in the space of the world. Now, you could say, you could substitute, right, in what you're talking about, the camera and the mise en scene, the gaze in Merleau-Ponty, or vision, and the world itself, right? And so I think what might be interesting about like a Merleau-Pontian film, a Merleau-Pontian style of film, would be to have something like a mirror phenomenon happening, in which the camera person, the one who is shooting, is also present in the scene.
Yeah, of course, in modern film, Godard and so on and so forth, that's exactly what you have. Where is the flash of perception? Where is that in Merleau-Ponty?
I'm sorry, could you say more about the flash of perception?
No, I'm just asking you where,
where
you read that in Merleau-Ponty.
Yes, that is a concept developed in his last unpublished book called The Visible and the Invisible.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Any further questions or comments?
Deleuze has a somewhat significant analysis of mise en scène in the cinema books, because he thinks that the role of it has shifted not only be through the shift into cinema itself or into like moving images, but because of the focus of the films themselves, where like action sometimes becomes de-emphasized and the subjective character becomes foreground and so on and so forth. So the objects in the film take on more like autonomy in themselves. They're not merely like background or scene setting, but become another like agential mode or node within the film, especially if they need to take on like a symbolic read that is related to a character's subjective psychological state, and symbolism functions through these kinds of like but in order for that, the scene setting has to have this kind of like autonomy within the film, at least Deleuze claims. Anyway, that's just a few things about that concept from Deleuze.
Well, I appreciate your reminding me about that again. I believe it's in Cinema One.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a whole understanding that filmmaking brings to the world because of what he's talking about there. That really kind of follows on Merleau-Ponty rather than kind of contradicts what he's saying.
Yeah. So I have a lot of this concept of horizon is extremely important to phenomenology. And horizon is related to limits. And we've seen, I mean, I think that was absolutely right, Spore, that in the phenomenological tradition, you're always going to butt up against sort of brute being, and the access or the relationship between the person who perceives or what Sartre analyzes as a subject or Heidegger as Dasein and being in time is going to have at least a troubled interface with that being. Sometimes being is going to be totally inaccessible. Sometimes it's going to be distorted or whatever. And the horizon is going to do a lot of work around sort of delimiting like what is within the subject's sphere of perception. I think when you get into like Deleuze and later people in the Continental tradition, this is one of the things they're trying to get past or explain in a different way. Deleuze, I think in particular, wants to almost do a more radical kind of phenomenology. Deleuzians are going to like jump up and down and smack me on the nose and say, no, 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 no. But, he says that he's doing a kind of metaphysics. He doesn't shrink away. And he seems to say that he's doing it in a kind of traditional way. Because I think he wants to try to go to the things themselves in a way that phenomenology often will foreclose on. Like it says to the things itself in its motto. And then when you get to the thing in and of itself and being, it's like, but also, no, not really, because it has to be an appearance to something that's like prefiguring it and establishing it. But Deleuze recognizes that there's been all kinds of important philosophical work in the post-Kantian tradition and in phenomenology, and he wants to like get all of those insights out of there. And one way that he does that is to go back to like pre-modern people like Spinoza or Leibniz and like reinterpret them through again like the post-Kantian positions to get a kind of like classically metaphysical kind of philosophy that's still trying to account for something like, why do we have the phenomenological feel of an inside, like an enclosure against some sort of exterior? That Deleuze is going to explain that like through the fold, through topological folding and things like that. But it's a totally different site of metaphysical contest for Deleuze, because he thinks phenomenology still rests on this theoretical distinction between the subject and the object that phenomenology itself has been claiming to undermine. Heidegger says there's no inside, there's no inner sphere from which one travels out into the world and so on. Sartre says that the subject-object distinction is merely logical, is a merely formal distinction and so on. Okay, I'm going to stop on that for a second. I'm preempting myself.
Well, I mean, that might be a very natural transition into our next presentation. But first, again, Spore, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Um, yes, yeah, a round of applause. And now let's move on to Deleuze and into Nancy. Donovan Irven, take it away.
I'm gonna totally undermine Animal and let anyone like ask any follow-up or say anything about anything I said previous if they want to. I'd be happy to elaborate or
I did say that you could be a co-host, so I guess that means you have the power. Fine. In front of everybody, fine.
maybe people would say no.
No, you're good. You're good.
I figured people might want to push back and say I'm being too harsh to phenomenology or too something. I don't know.
Everyone, I give everybody the floor. You all have at it. I'm press mute.
I'm still personally waving the phenomenology flag, so you know. Okay. I'm going to talk about Deleuze and then Jean-Luc Nancy, and in order to make what I'm saying accessible, I want to do some scene setting, which actually Spore really was helpful because their presentation included a lot of the themes that are important to French philosophy, which makes sense because Merleau-Ponty is really like at the heart of mid-century French philosophy with the existentialists and that kind of stuff. So I want to riff on a few of those themes to set up what Deleuze is doing in particular, and then also how Nancy is responding to certain things that follow. Because Nancy is like the next generation. Nancy is really in part important in the history of continental philosophy for sort of one, helping to establish Derrida as like a figure of study and Derrida's work. So he's important both for his contributions to deconstruction, but also for the way that he deals with the Hegelian influences of phenomenology and other kinds of things. And when Nancy talks about being, you'll see the Hegel stuff is really central to what he says about it. So one of the reasons Nancy is interested in Hegel to talk about being is because of the role that difference plays in Hegel's notion of being, and what Nancy wants to say about being and plurality and communication. And one of the reasons that difference is such a concern and why that draws someone like Nancy back to Hegel and so on and so forth is because Deleuze wrote difference and repetition. So Deleuze centers difference really, I think, and solidifies it as a central theme of continental philosophy and so on. Difference, I mean, is always an important thing to consider ontologically, but by making it the title of this book, Difference and Repetition, and by really driving it as a central theme, I think it becomes important in a way that it hadn't been before, where other words and other themes might have taken sort of center stage. One of the buzzwords I think that are important that Deleuze and Deleuze's generation wants to get around is the issues of metaphysics of presence, which is also a key issue in deconstruction and Derrida, and problems of representation and how things and how perception is conceived as being a representational procedure, a mapping of the world and representing that back to the subject in a mental image or whatever kind of thing. I'm being a little reductive, but that's the general kind of idea there. I think the phenomenologists that Deleuze has in mind, he wants to give them credit for actually moving us to a place where those older answers about perception as a kind of representation and how the representation stands in for the object and so on, like actually don't work. I think he takes very seriously Sartre's injunction at the beginning of Being and Nothingness, that being basically philosophy has been advanced by reducing being to appearance. But the problem for Deleuze is that as soon as you allow that, the question immediately arises, appearance to what? And now you have the seed and the germ of that subject-object dichotomy. And so much hay in the mid-century and immediately post-war was made out of that subject-object. I mean, the whole of being and nothingness, all of the kind of inter-phenomenology wars about what intentionality is and stuff hinge upon these sorts of things. And so I think Deleuze wants to recognize that the promise of phenomenology was to get us sort of outside of that somehow, to get us back to the ground on which metaphysics sort of could be done. And as long as you have this metaphysics of presence at play, and the theory of perception that goes along with that is bound up in representational schemes and so on and so forth, you're always going to have like the ghost problem, basically. And you're not really going to get into the kind of metaphysical monism that Deleuze thinks the phenomenologists are really like getting at. I talk about Sartre because he's the one I know and he has a huge influence on Deleuze. You know, if Sartre is really to be seen as throwing his hat in the ring with dialectical materialism, then you have to be able to describe the metaphysics that Sartre is bringing to the table as a kind of like monism, sort of. And Deleuze is explicit about this, and he goes back to Duns Scotus, who's important for Heidegger. This is who Heidegger wrote one of his like master's thesis on Duns Scotus. Because Duns Scotus develops in the scholastic tradition the idea of the univocity of being. And then for Deleuze, the other person who's really important here is Spinoza. And the Spinoza book by Deleuze is extremely important, I think, for understanding Deleuze's general. But of course, you can't just return to Spinozan substance monism, right? That's what Deleuze, I think, that's the genius of Deleuze, is how is he going to transform this into something that makes sense given post-Kantian philosophy and the phenomenological tradition and all that kind of stuff, right? And Sartre is not really going to talk about metaphysics in this way. Like, it's just not really what he did. Even though I think if you read the Critique of Dialectical Reason, you're going to see Deleuze reflected in there and back and, so on and so forth. Okay, so that's, I think, the first thing. We have to think about a kind of monism in Deleuze or some kind of univocity of being. The other thing that you have to think about in Deleuze is the thing that's always there with all of these folks is Nietzsche and the inversion of Platonism and the destruction of the transcendental world and all of this kind of stuff that's been heralded, the death of God. I think Deleuze really wants to take radically a philosophy. He wants to write a radical philosophy of eminence. And that's why the monism is appealing, because it gets us all on the same plane. And when he starts to talk about planes, the plane of eminence, the plane of consistency, the body without organs, which we'll get to here, I promise. It makes me sweat just thinking about it. Having to explain the body without organs. Just like, oh God. Okay. But, these all have to be these are all, sort of geometric, topological types of concepts. And that allows Deleuze to shift his discourse away from talking about horizons. And now what he does retain from that is, and I think he takes this very seriously. So I think this is something from phenomenology that Deleuze really kind of sees as being correct in a way. And he wants to sort of bring this insight. You still have to be able to explain sort of subjectivation and how subjects are formed, Although Deleuze seems to be very skeptical about subjects generally. And it doesn't really seem like he wants to fully admit subjects, but he does want to be able to talk about not just individuation and differentiation, but he doesn't want to just hand wave away the what it's like to be situated and inscribed on a plane, because he's going to recommend that you do certain practices, right? He wants you to become a nomadic war machine, and deterritorialize striated spaces in the creation of radical new societies. And what does it to make yourself into a body without organs in order to resist totalizing social structures and hegemonic appropriations of radical philosophies and to organize society and yourself differently. So if we really take seriously the political dimension and Deleuze's and Guattari, you really have to emphasize Guattari here. You can't put it all in Deleuze, because Guattari is the clinician and the practicing one. In a way, right? So the idea that these concepts can be operationalized and are working concepts and are not merely abstractions is important to Deleuze, and is key to understanding why Deleuze will say things like, this is not a metaphor. The body without organs is not a metaphor. He wants to break with a tradition that sees a relationship with a being as one built only on analogies, on estimations. Because if we're all being formed, if we're all formations on the plane of immanence, then we really are making direct contact with everything. There's not necessarily a kind of mediation between the two. If we cling to the idea that there has to be some sort of projection of a representation to an inside, well, that can only be generated by a relationship between exteriorities that generate the inside itself and whose relationships constitute the image generated on the inside. So on that score, everything that's related and is generating any sort of internal image is real and producing an effect of real relationships inscribed on the same sort of like plane. Though he does talk about there being different levels or different sort of things. So we can deal with that a little bit. Now, let me back up just one second. I don't think Deleuze is saying that this is what's happening. What I'm saying is, hypothetically, even if we grant to the representation people that there's an image form, if you adopt the plane of immanence as an idea, it's all being generated within the same like material substance or something like that. But I don't think we have to appeal to the projection or to the representation anymore. And I think Deleuze wants to argue that the time of the representation is over, and we have found a way out. We've traced a line of flight out of the abyss of representation that deconstruction and structuralism throw us into. Because signs then okay, does anyone want to ask a question or stop me and have anything like clarified or anything at this point?
I wonder, this body without organs, that it is not a metaphor. Does that sort of open a portal for us or an avenue of reaching that immanence? Is that crucial for him, or is that statement more of just like an offshoot and a product of the fact or of the immanence that he's trying to?
I don't know what to make of it sometimes. I think it can be a little bit hyperbolic. He seems to be claiming that nothing that he's saying is a metaphor, that he's not using metaphors to try to approximate being or anything like that. That he's just describing what is directly, in a way. I think that's why he wants to say that I'm doing metaphysics. I'm making speculative claims on the ontological level, not merely on the ontic level. I think Spore did a good job of indicating Heidegger's ontological distinction between being and beings, and Deleuze wants to sort of make these speculative claims, metaphysical claims, And I think one of the things he's doing rhetorically when he says these aren't metaphors is trying to indicate a kind of direct description. Also, too, like when you look at like the kind of funny in the Foucault book, I don't have it right here immediately by me. Deleuze draws a kind of diagram of the fold of subjectivity. And it's kind of humorous in a couple of different ways. Sort of resembles an anus. It's like it's but it's significant in a way, right? Because if you're a fold of space, like your body is literally a fold, and you have a hollow of space running through your interior from your mouth to your anus, and your body is just a material fold in space. And again, this is one of the ways to explain for Deleuze, like, why do we have this persistent feeling of an inside and an outside, of an exteriority and an interiority, right? But it can't be because there's two metaphysically distinct spheres. It has to be somehow that whatever it is we're calling exteriority is capable of producing an interiority. And vice versa. The interiority founds a kind of exteriority. They're in a mutually defined relationship. And again, he likes to appeal to a kind of geometry or topology, because then it is truly mutually informing. Like the very drawing up of the fold to create the enclosure also creates the exteriority of the enclosure, and so on and so forth. So it's not like a one or another. You don't have a problem of like a priority or any, these things come to, are arranged. And when you're dealing with the plane of eminence, it's self-arranging, it's auto-arranging. So one of the reasons why he's interested in the body without organs is because he's interested not only in how an outside and an inside form and meet, but also how things are internally differentiated. And the body, in Difference and Repetition, he doesn't talk about the body without organs yet, but he talks about eggs and how eggs are, it's a body. So it's a body, it's a material thing, it's in space, it can be, it's a surface, things can be inscribed on it, but it's not internally differentiated yet. But it has the possibility for internal differentiation, and it differentiates itself according to an internal logic that allows it to become the kind of thing that it is. And so the body without organs is about self-internal differentiation. And that's why it's kind of rebellious, because in order to, you have to do some uncoding to recode, so to speak. Insofar as we've ever been bodies without organs, as soon as you enter into these relationships with other beings and social institutions and all that stuff, there's a lot of codification and being inscribed on the plane of eminence in how social spaces are arranged and buildings are made and rules are outlined in the physical world and stored and transferred and so on and so forth. There's a lot of coding and a lot of striation, and things being inscribed. And you also get encoded in certain ways. And so to become about a body without organs is basically to like go through a process of self-destruction and erasure in order to clear away in order to make room or the possibility of a reinscription or a recreation of the subject under a new kind of regime. So when we talk about discrete things that appear, they often use the language of assemblage. That's the typical English translation. You'll find assemblage is the thing, but it rings with a couple of important like synonyms, especially in French, like schema, like Kantian schemata, something that's like gathered and arrayed and like laid out. So a layout of a thing, and you can see again, if you just think of a plane that can be folded and manipulated and made into different objects. This arrangement or array, assemblage of things is just what allows objects to appear as discrete. They're assembled or arranged or arrayed in this particular way, and they create the boundary that would demark the object. That is where you find the back and forth of an inside and an outside. And of course, again, this has political implications. The border area, of course, then becomes a contested area and a site of always latent and potential violence, because it's the site of these sort of radical and abrupt territorializations and reterritorializations, as the boundary has to be constantly reinscribed on this plane of eminence in order to maintain the enclosure that is the discrete sort of object. So here you can think of cities, countries, and the significance of the development of the nation state in part arises because the city is able to push its boundaries out into like almost the no man's land and establish a boundary that's not tied to an immediate like concrete structure like a castle or citadel or something like that. So they're interested in this idea of these like border regions as contested sites that have to be maintained, or they become flattened and deterritorialized and subject to like reinscription and appropriation and so on. These are why the nomadic war machines are effective, because the nomadic war machines flatten. They're no respecter of striations, right? So they come through and sort of prepare the way for a new formation.
I ask this because I find fascinating the different treatment of simultaneity and eminence between, you know, what Merleau-Ponty is happening or saying, what Deleuze is saying, and then what Husserl is saying. You know, we've got to know on the Merleau-Ponty front, but on the Husserl front, we can obtain that eminence within the flow of the now. And he said it is absolute subjectivity and has the absolute properties of something to be designated metaphorically as flow, of something that originates in a point of actuality and a primal source point, the now, and so on. In the actuality experience, we have the primal source point and a continuity of moments of reverberation. For all this, we lack names. So what I find fascinating is this continuity of Husserl in contrast with this discreteness that Deleuze is describing. Now, with this constant battle at the border of this clearing away in the so that new moments may emerge and new whatever may emerge, is this cycle, it's, or maybe not cycle itself, this movement, action itself, this direction itself, is that something continuous, or is it discrete as well?
It is both.
Oh,
yeah, it is both. So Deleuze and Guattari. So now we're getting into. Oh, by the way, so if you're interested more in the body without organs, I recommend Acid Horizon is a good theory podcast. And Craig did a couple of Deleuze at the very beginning. They're way back at episodes like 2 or 3 of it. And he does one on the body without organs that I think is pretty solid. The only thing that it's a minor criticism is just that he uses only one source in order to try to explain the concept. And with Deleuze, which he explains the concept very well. This is a very minor thing that I'm saying. Deleuze will deploy a concept in multiple different ways, and it has a couple of different valences. So while I think Craig's presentation of the concept was very good, I think listeners are left with an impression that they might be able to read just one book and get a kind of definition of a body without organs out of it. Whereas Deleuze is really annoying in one way if you are like me and want to read and get your handle on it, in that he allows the concepts to evolve throughout their deployment, so that you never quite have a stable concept that is the body without organs. that you can neatly be like, and here it is, in a neat bow. So even though I've just done that, and I've just commended Craig of Acid Horizon that I think he does a great job doing that, ultimately, like, I think Deleuze wants to be like, you can't quite do that, because the context of the concept's deployment determines the meaning of the concept in a radical way, because the concept is a function of what's happening on the plane of immanence. It's not a separate floating signifier that is freely attached. It's always like an emergent thing that has to do with what is happening, what's modulating, what's flowing around there.
And so continuity and discreteness could be battling it out on that plane of immanence.
And the rhizome is important. So they take to task the idea that we tend to think vertically in terms of like a tree with solid roots. And this is related to a critique of psychoanalysis and the center of the phallic symbolism. Of course, the sturdy, erect tree, supports the all, and that the academic can repose in the shade of this, giant phallus. And they prefer the rhizome, which they view as a horizontal structure. But the rhizome allows for both continuities and discontinuities, because the rhizome in its horizontal structure can trace a line that's continuous, but it can also break. It can encounter an obstacle, and they talk about this in terms of lines of flight away from. But these negative things are always also a positive, because it has to sketch a positive trajectory, so to speak. It has to have some alternative already in mind. This is an idea that goes back to existentialism. You can see this in Camus. My no to the world implies with it a yes, and so on and so forth. But the rhizome allows for both the continuity and the discontinuity. So the break. I think this is actually something very interesting that Deleuze shares with Foucault some. Everyone always wants to emphasize that Foucault is interested in historical discontinuities and breaks. But that's like not entirely accurate either, because the only way you could recognize a break is by also recognizing that there was some continuity before. So I think Deleuze and Foucault share a kind of interest in the interrelationship between what we call a continuity and what we call a discontinuity, especially when we're talking about histories, personal, institutional, whatever the case may be, and when we're talking about flows of material goods, essentially economic flows. It's important to be able to recognize both continuities and discontinuities. We should be able to, if we adopt this metaphysical position, there should be some practical upshots, especially ones that allow us to sort of like analyze social, political, material conditions. It shouldn't be necessarily like anti-Marxist per se, because it's viewing this as because it has this metaphysical monism. So it should kind of play nice with a dialectical materialism, sort of, although orthodox Marxists will say absolutely not. How dare you? And Deleuze isn't interested in being an orthodox Marxist anyway, but I think he wants his metaphysics to be a metaphysics of, anti-Oedipus is supposed to be anti-fascist.
Yeah. Before I keep hugging, but oh man, I really wish that Neil deGrasse Tyson would listen to some Deleuze, because I also am thinking that some problems in quantum physics between discrete and continuous can be solved. So, anyways, those are all the questions I have. Everyone else.
I can recap just real. So being, if you were going to give a really vulgar summary of being in Deleuze, it's kind of there's a univocity to it. There has to be a kind of metaphysical monism, but we can't allow ourselves to just go back to a kind of a substance dualism. So you get the plane of eminence. The plane of eminence is also related to a plane of consistency. And I think this plane of being is like quasi-stable, again, like the continuity discontinuity thing, there is a kind of consistency to it. It has regularities in it. It has laws that can be sort of discerned. That's one of the things that physics is doing, is trying to suss out this kind of thing. And there is a little of the Kantian vibe of a condition of the possibility of something, right? And again, I think you have to understand Deleuze when he goes back to early modern philosophy, when he's buggering the early modern philosophers, he's sort of like buggering them through Kant and the post-Kantian tradition in order to like transform their view into something that's viable in this philosophical context, this age, right? And Deleuze views himself as creating the concepts necessary to give voice to to these insights now. He thinks with Guattari that philosophy is the creation of concepts, and we must have some sort of like need for these concepts now. Like, well, you don't just create them out of like nothing, out of like thin air. They must be addressed to some call or something that is perceived by the philosopher, or the thinker. So in that way, I think it also shares a kind of kinship with phenomenology, because it does place philosophy as like a special relationship with being. Is a human being the plane of eminence coming to recognize itself as such? Is there like a latent Hegelianism in Deleuze? Certainly he goes, okay.
Louis, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the plane of immanence. Mm-hmm. And before you do that, I just wanted to throw in a kind of speculative comment here. So I lived for a fair amount of time in Vietnam, and one thing you notice immediately not about Vietnamese architecture is that there's no recognition in the Western sense of inside and outside. And what I mean by that is that life in Vietnam seems to go on a kind of continuous shifting threshold between what we would call the sidewalk and then the kind of immediate interior or porch or threshold of the house. And the streets are not anything like Western streets. I tried to write about that in terms of Vietnamese film and the rhizome. It had immediate implications in a military sense with the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I hate to bring in something so far from philosophy, but they could never find the Ho Chi Minh Trail because it didn't exist in the normal sense of a trail. Mm-hmm. It not only was constantly changing, it didn't have a kind of embodiment in some kind of a stable, preconditioned, fixed point of view that you would have in in the Western gaze, or whatever you want to call it. So I wonder if some of these questions aren't just questions of culture.
Deleuze and Guattari explicitly think that they are, and they sometimes throw the West around and put it in scare quotes and do different things. They sort of blame the philosophical conundrum that they're trying to get out of on sort of the West, but they also think that it's part of the sort of, there's not anyone to blame either, because it's part of the sort of material and political and history of it. Like, I think they really think that the kinds of subjectivity that we conceive ourselves as having is really significantly related to like the political development in Germany in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the foundation of the German university and they're not, just grasping at straws because, at the foundation of these, you have von Humboldt, but also Fichte, and Fichte's absolute I. And, and that kind of subjectivity that has its roots in Hegel and, post-Kantian philosophy and German idealism, that gets picked up and disseminated through the state education system and the apparatus of the state. So the Deleuze and Guattari are also always talking about how the philosophers have written in the service of the state. And the kinds of subjects that philosophy has promoted are amenable to certain political formations. And that is not a coincidence. It's not a grand conspiracy. It's not a grand, no one's like, they're not evil people, but it's also not like, it's accidental only in the sense that it's an accident of history and it's a material contingency. But it also like is a material contingency. So the things are related in a way, and people's philosophies are useful for things and they're ideologically convenient. And those philosophers were themselves historical actors and, were formed in given their situations and so on and so forth. So, yeah, let me double check myself here, but I mean, Difference in Repetition was published in France in 1968. And then, of course, Anti-Oedipus is, I mean, there's very few other books that really express the kind of spirit of May 68 than Anti-Oedipus. I mean, Debord, yeah. I don't know.
And The Plane of Immanence?
Well, what about it?
Well, talk about it. What?
It's everything. It's the more I talk about it, the more slippery it gets, because you have to understand it. Okay, so rather than a substance, I think a substance is too fixed in time, and it doesn't allow for the sort of procedural formation and deformation, the territorialization and deterritorialization, because substance is kind of imagining something as fixed, and we get back into the essence and existence problem and all that kind of stuff. But flows, they get very into the idea of flows, particularly as they're expressed in like economic theories, and they see flows as being like codified very broadly in a lot of different discourses and modes of knowledge. And you can use flow to then describe like the movement and the shift on a topology, like a topological shift. So you can talk about a geometrical plane that has like certain discernible flows on it, where the structures again are all related to each other on the plane. The other thing that I'm not really equipped to talk about that's important to Deleuze, because I don't know the math well enough, but is Riemann, I forget how it's spelled, structures. And what is interesting about them for Deleuze, and I am not the best with the math behind it, but it's a complex topology. And if you Google it, you'll see an image that is kind of like a crumpled up piece of paper. But the structure is interesting because you can pick all kinds of different regions of it. And the regions all display almost like self-enclosed geometric rules, because you'll have all kinds of crazy like curves and bends in relationship to each other and all kinds of folds and insides and outsides and so on and so forth. So I think Deleuze almost views this as like it's like a mathematical object that gives us a glimpse of what reality is like. If we can imagine one of these things in like motion all the time and all of these different structures like emerging out of this topology in relationship to one another and like flowing around. And if you do this on long enough time scales, you'll see cities build up and come and do this and emerge, and buildings come down over here in this neighborhood, and then maybe a disaster comes and wipes the whole thing away, and then the mountain comes rising up over. I mean, you could do like a time-lapse photograph of the whole history of everything, and imagine it as all just like this plane that's constantly differentiating itself in all of these flows and waves. And then what they then think is, as if you dive down into that, you want to analyze the relationship between different parts, different things that have been differentiated, how they differentiate themselves, how they relate to different parts. And then you get into like the machinic talk, and like the abstract machine and that kind of stuff. It gets a lot more, I think, interesting and complicated than what I'm about to say, but an entry point or a way to start thinking about it that makes some sense is that these things are basically regulating flows.
Are we understanding flows as sort of patterns of experience, and then any sort of particular, maybe, I don't know, naturalistic scientific investigation of these flows is sort of like a higher order thing that we're studying, but of course we want to get beyond these representations of things, but that the flow is just kind of like a pattern, different patterns that we see? Or am I being too Husserlian?
I think you're being too Husserlian with the experience thing, because okay. I think if you really pushed him, Deleuze would say this is a description of what the world is like.
Okay, so beyond our experience, like what is, okay, gotcha.
I think when he says I'm doing metaphysics in a traditional sense, when he's talking about like the plane of eminence and that kind of stuff, he takes himself to be describing the world as it is in itself, so to speak.
Gotcha, thank you.
I think that's why he says stuff like these aren't metaphors. Some of it is a rhetorical. He's super French, which is cool. I'm into that. That's fine. But, I do think he's using some rhetorical ploys to really try to be like, you need to meet me where I'm at, because I'm trying at least to play like a different sort of game. I think Deleuze is a systematic philosopher in an important sense of that word, in that he thinks that the metaphysical project that he's doing is going to have very wide ramifications across many, many, many domains. And one of the reasons why he feels the need to attend to this project is because it's almost like philosophy's gotten ahead of itself. It's having these insights about the nature of subjectivity and of knowledge and of history and of the social construction of the world and how all that stuff, but it doesn't actually have the metaphysics to explain how all that's actually really happening. And so Deleuze is like, I'm going to sort of tell that story. Like, given where we've come post-Kant through these movements, I'm going to kind of go back to doing a sort of metaphysics to provide a picture of the world in which these sorts of decentered subjects and all this kind of stuff can actually sort of operate.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Wouldn't that be because there's a kind of failure of language, of language to keep up with these kinds of insights, or the language we're using is derailed by technological society and its insistence on a certain kind of structure?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a big problem. That is a political problem of like of having things captured, of capitalism becoming. They don't really talk about hegemony in the same way as like, this isn't like Althusser or but capitalism has a really, It's able to capture things and incorporate. That's why they talk about schizoanalysis, and Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus are capitalism and schizophrenia, because capitalism has this sort of unique or definitive ability to excuse me, sir. Hey, he's deterritorializing my wall back there. Better get down. I might have to go chase him away.
I'm having the same problem with my dog at this very
capitalism is able to maintain an insane, like a literally insane level of contradiction and tension within itself. And I use like goofy examples, like they sell Che Guevara t-shirts and things, it commodifies even the things that are supposed to be instruments of its critique and just, and destruction and so on. It's very good at that. And so it has all of these like contradictions that I think at the end of the day aren't like sustainable, right? They're trying to move us politically beyond the current capitalist situation. But one of the reasons why politically Deleuze is hesitant to hand us nice, neat concepts in a nice package is because the way they always get taken up within a dominant discourse and transformed. Just practically speaking, the easiest example for me to pick of this is Martin Luther King and how he gets presented versus the words that he wrote, or the way that his words get selectively processed and presented, and made into like an object that can easily circulate within the already codified flows of capital accumulation and so on and so forth. So in one sense, like the language game being played by the Deleuze is like a kind of guerrilla warfare against the capture of the language of criticism by the dominant discourses. You can see insights into this more if you look at like a minor literature, a book on Kafka. I think it's called Toward a Minor Literature now, but regardless, if you Google Deleuze Kafka book, you'll find this Toward a Minor Literature. So the idea of minor literatures as something that's occurring kind of against the grain of a dominant or major literary discourse, and something that's kind of underground or under the radar. So, the nomadic war machine, to talk about the guerrilla warfare in Vietnam and so on, those are connections I think that Deleuze would be happy to see. And A Thousand Plateaus in particular is a book that is all over the place in terms of making wild connections, drawing seemingly unrelated things into dialogue with one another, again, heightening that feeling of like sort of tension and multiplicity, to make univocal beings sing with a apparent multivocity in order to find every possible way out of the capture by the dominant discourse and the reification of Deleuze and Guattari's ideas back into the smooth operation of the status quo or something like that. I think they view themselves as being like really disruptive. They become ungovernable, so to speak. This is not to say, though, that the nomadic war machine that they advocate is totally without reason or without any kind of order or anything like that. You don't get a purely unstriated, a smooth space or something like that. There's always the interplay of territorialization and re-territorialization. You're not going to just be deterritorialized and out in some radically open thing or something like that. There's always a kind of process. Again, I think they've abandoned the language of dialectics largely, but I think it's a theory that still plays nice with ideas about a back and forth, give and take, developmental interplay, not progress, emphatically not progress, but a sensible movement between things. Both can be continuous and discontinuous. Because you can only, a discontinuity isn't of itself sensible. You can see there's something before the shift and then something different. I mean, that is sensible, right? That's not chaos or anything.
Thank you for that.
I have to admit, I am anything insightful that I said about Deleuze here is a credit to Dan Smith. Dan W. Smith was my dissertation chair, and I did not personally write on Deleuze, but you did not exist around Dan without absorbing Deleuze. His introduction to Essays, Critical and Clinical is one of the finest pieces of introductory writing I've ever encountered. And anything I said insightful about Deleuze is entirely due to him. And anything that I said that was wrong or foolish is my fault. So,
sorry, what did you say that book was?
Essays, Critical and Clinical. It's a book by Deleuze, but Dan wrote the introduction to it. And it's just the fun. His book, Essays on Deleuze by Edinburgh, is very good. He's just very good at explaining Deleuze. That meme, explain it to me clearly, don't dumb it down. You just need to take Dan to that person and sit him down and be like, here. And he does it really well. It's really incredible. The very first class I ever had in my PhD program was Dan's postmodern philosophy class. It was just a class on Foucault and Deleuze. That was all it was. It's just Foucault Deleuze seminar. Yeah.
Side note, the Lawn Chair Philosophy Foundation should probably have in place some structures or rituals by which folks can absolve themselves of their academic sins. But just note that in lieu of those, you have my forgiveness.
So I have Spore is coming here and talking and taking on the full burden of responsibility. I have an easy out. I can just in bad faith be like, I don't know. I'm just repeating what I was told. So I commend Spore's courage.
I do have a comment, which is that I think that Merleau-Ponty and Deleuze are not as far apart as Deleuze maybe wants to insist that they are. And I understand that Deleuze is trying to create an alternative language or an alternative way of doing philosophy, which escapes some of the bypasses of phenomenology. But there are so many points in comparing their works where I see moments of resonance, right? So this notion, you mentioned the notion of a fold. Well, that idea is also in Merleau-Ponty's work, right? Like he says that life is not a sort of quasi-interiority, but it's only the fold, the reality of a process. And that vision, my vision, is produced when being itself folds back onto itself, when the phenomena of the world become to like a sort of self-awareness through me. And this relationship between things in my body by which being becomes aware of itself through me, I think relates to what you were saying about the univocity of being. Now, this may be in a bit of a contradiction with Deleuze's desire for an immediate or non-mediated access to being, because Merleau-Ponty is insistent, this is a very Hegelian point, that mediation is the immediate access to being, right? Insofar as being is nothing other than its own self-differentiation into beings in the world, right? So Merleau-Ponty is in one sense rejecting Heidegger's strict ontological ontic distinction, because he says you find being, capital B being, in the beings of the world. Ontology is everywhere, he writes. But being is precisely like this mediation. And so it problematizes like a strict opposition between identity and difference, right? And again, it's a very Hegelian thing he's doing. He writes like, what do I bring to the problem of the same and of the other? this. It's that the same be other than the other, and identity is difference of difference. So there is not identity nor non-identity or non-coincidence, but inside and outside turning about one another. An inside and outside which has been produced by the folding of being back onto itself. So that's my remark. I don't have a question. It's just a remark. But thank you for your presentation.
Oh, you're very welcome, and I agree. And I also agree basically that, you know, deconstruction is also not like a radically anti-phenomenology philosophy, as much as people sometimes make it out. And I think, you know, Deleuze, this is a non-philosophical point, so I apologize, but I think Deleuze is in a position of having to distinguish himself from Foucault and Sartre, and because I agree with you, and when you look at what he says about the situation, this is it's not as well known in English, because I don't believe this book of interviews with Deleuze has been translated. But anyway, Deleuze says about Sartre and the situation is not a concept among others, but the pragmatic element that transforms everything, without which concepts have neither meaning nor structure. A concept has no structure or meaning as long as it is not situated. The situation is the functioning of the concept itself. Okay, well then, then all Deleuze is ultimately saying is that, okay, so we're situated on a plane of eminence. I mean, I don't think he's making some great dissension from Sartre either, though you don't really see as many references to Sartre in Deleuze's work. So I'm there with you. I think there are these affinities between phenomenology and existential philosophy, like sort of proper, and what Deleuze and people like Derrida are doing. And I think we're quick sometimes to gloss over where they're carrying the torch for each other and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, you're very, very welcome. I really like that late Merleau-Ponty stuff. I don't know it as well, but every time I go to it, I'm like, yeah, this is like we lost a lot when Merleau-Ponty died young.
But we're still getting new translations of his books. I think one just came out this month. So.
Yeah. I'm also totally here. I've said it many times. I'm totally here for the Beauvoir revival kind of that's going on. And I've sort of neglected Jean-Luc Nancy, but something, now I'm forgetting, something Spore had said really spawned in me this idea of Nancy basically thinks that being is meaning, that being and meaning is inseparable, and communication is therefore, in some ways, Nancy is going back again to the relationship between someone to whom the world, or something to whom the world appears and therefore has some kind of meaning. And so he almost like just says it right out in a being singular plural. He just says, being itself is given to us as meaning. Being does not have meaning. So Heidegger's question is a little off. Being itself, and here's the nod to the appearance, the phenomenon of being, he says, being itself, the phenomenon of being, is meaning. That is, in turn, its own circulation. So here we're on the Deleuze train a little bit with the flows and the circulation and that kind of stuff. But remember, Derrida's already talked about that as well, with the economy of death and the circulation of the sign, through that as well. Okay, being itself, the phenomenon of being, is meaning. That is, in turn, its own circulation, and we are this circulation. So in some ways, he gives a lot of arguments throughout a couple different essays to support that, but his position on being is like very clear. And this is why communication for Nancy is such a key theme. And really, he builds out of an idea of community and communication, a theory of being sort of later. His earlier works are a lot on community and we subjectivity. And then you get a more sort of explicit confrontation with Hegel and the theory of this theory of being as meaning and us as the communicators or carriers of that meaning who circulate it and so on later, which also again is concerned about this idea of the problem of presence, right? That we're not quite ever fully in the presence of something's always absent or lacking. Again, that's why it goes back to Hegel, because of that dialectic between being and nothing and so on. It goes really explicitly to Hegel. And like in The Birth to Presence, just does really close readings of passages in a couple of different essays from the Encyclopedia Logic. So he's really, there's some like just straightforward Hegel scholarship going on in Nancy. That's a little different than what you'd find in Deleuze. And I think that Nancy embraces a little bit more stridently the deconstructive commitment to the abyss of representation and the problem of the signifier and its detachment from what it signifies. Where Deleuze wants to sort of get away from that whole mode of thinking about things. He's like, no, we're not, the signifier and all that's done. That is the dead philosophy. We're not even really going to talk about how that circulation in that way anymore. That's what Deleuze likes about Sartre and the idea of the situation, because he can embed the concept, what he thinks is deeply in the situation, such that it can't become separated from it and float around like a ghost or something that can then be attached to some particular that you see in front of you. It has to be a function of the thing, it's the situation itself or the territory itself. Nancy, I don't think, is committed as much to that view. But Nancy is also a philosopher who works in a much more religious valence, and who is interested in the theological problems of Christianity, and specifically its more mystical formations, like in the Gospel of John. Nancy has a fairly, I think it's a pretty good book, but if you're not theologically inclined, it might kind of pass you by, called Disenclosure, which is subtitled just really straightforward deconstruction of Christianity. And a lot of it is about how the image within Christianity sort of functions to disclose divinity, which is something that can't be fully disclosed and all that sort of thing. Though Nancy himself is not, it's hard to say what his mode of religiosity is. He's certainly not like Jean-Luc Marion or a Jack Caputo, who are clearly like Catholic. And Nancy is, an avowed communist and so on. So it's difficult to say exactly what is motivating his interest in those religious modes, other than they're like dominant forms of culture that need to be like looked at and analyzed and sort of taken seriously. And you can't just brush them aside, I don't think Nancy thinks. There's a little rush sometimes, I think, to destroy the past that Nancy is, because of he's interested in community, and communities depend upon a shared something. He's a little more interested in a critical examination and appropriation of tradition and so on. Very kind of Gadamerrian in that way. Yeah. Whereas there's almost a kind of anti-hermeneutics in Deleuze.
Can you say a little bit more about that anti-hermeneutics in Deleuze versus something more Gadamerrian that's happening in Nancy?
Yeah. Oh no, I fear I've said something now I can't explain as well as I'd like to. The task of interpretation ceases to become a practice of like mere reflection or one of like esoteric rumination over a text. And so I don't think when a scholar like Jean-Luc Nancy or Derrida goes to a text, the text takes on, it has like a holiness almost. There's some, one of the things that drives me crazy about how people crap on deconstruction and go after Derrida is that Derrida is very careful, and he has like he like prostrates himself before the text and wants to go through it like so meticulously and obsess over this and that and the other. And there is a kind of like religiosity, I feel like, to the way that deconstruction and other things sort of come at a text. And you would never find this sort of like discussion of Hegel's encyclopedia logic the way that it occurs in Nancy or Derrida in Deleuze. That's not how Deleuze goes at the history of philosophy. Yeah, you'll find discussions of Hegel's encyclopedia logic in Deleuze, but it does not have this kind of like scholastic reverence and exegetical feeling to it. Like when you read Deleuze's books on Hume and Spinoza and even Foucault, even when you read his Foucault book, you're not reading, Deleuze is not trying to explain to you Spinoza's theory of, you know, he's kind of trying to do that, but he's trying to make Spinoza work to do Deleuze's philosophy. That's why he says that, you know, he buggers historical figures and they birth monsters or whatever, you know, and that kind of stuff.
Gotcha. So this is not only a tie to Gadamerrian sort of hermeneutics, but the tradition, the religious tradition of hermeneutics and how we read this text. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, Deleuze just doesn't have that kind of reverence. He's irreverent, you know, in exactly a way that it's just a whole different feeling reading his commentary on other philosophers than reading someone like Nancy or Derrida. And I think that the tradition of deconstruction has that vibe. It has that feel to it. And I think that's why the rhetoric of deconstruction sometimes feels the way it does. You know, kind of pronouncement heavy, slow sort of plotting, turning over the text in a certain ways and so on. Yeah, people act like, oh, deconstruction means any text means anything. And I'm like, have you read any deconstruction? Like, it definitely doesn't mean that, because they're so obsessed with like poring over like the meaning that could be contained within these words that they recognize has ambiguity and multiple possible or conflicting interpretations, but it's not a free-for-all. It takes some care and attention to discern what the interpretations are, what's supported, you know, and so on.
And not to bring things back to any sort of classical principles, but if anything's going to be a first philosophy, it's let's pore over what these words can mean and what is way out of left field and inappropriate, and then let's go further into the bounds that we've discovered through these words. So I appreciate that.
Now, I don't think that Deleuze is not careful. I just think he's playing a different game. And if you read Deleuze thinking that he's going to explain Leibniz to you in some way, don't read Deleuze for that.
He's the after party.
Yeah. Because another very you know, intensities. I didn't even talk about intensities, but I mean, here's a whole other. We could talk for another half hour about intensities. And Deleuze, where does Deleuze kind of go? What's his, you know, what's he interested in? Leibniz. Leibniz wrote a kind of, maybe it's better known now, but when I was educated in philosophy, it wasn't as well known. You know, we read the monadology and blah, 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 blah. But Leibniz wrote like a point for point refutation or response to Locke's inquiry concerning human understanding called New Essays in Human Understanding or something like that. And Leibniz has like theories of perception and cognition and all kinds of things in there that are kind of responding to the empirical claims and doing it from his more rationalist grounding in that, you know, German tradition and so on. So Leibniz has intensity plays an important role in Leibniz's theory of perception because of the way he thinks monads constitute the world and that we're all interconnected in a certain way. And so basically things can be brought to our attention as a result of a threshold effect, where I talked about this in the Zen thing the other day. That's important for Deleuze. That notion of intensities is important, and he does a lot of work with it throughout several several of his writings. Really feel like I've done Jean-Luc Nancy dirty here today.
That's okay. Like I said, we're gonna discover some mechanisms to absolve everyone of their sins. You get there.
You get on Deleuze. The problem that Deleuze poses, that Jean-Luc Nancy poses another problem, that you have to kind of explain Hegel a little bit. You have to have a sense of like the problem of why is presence such a problem, especially when we get into this issue of meaning that Nancy is so concerned about, and why he doesn't want to say that being has meaning. Meaning isn't a property of being. Being is meaning that's communicated through these beings, that's us, and so on and so forth. Because that is him trying to stop with what becomes present as a representation of the object that must be behind it, and therefore the object's deferred. And now we're into the deconstruction problem. Now you're into the deference of the thing, both behind the veil of its representation, but also into some promise. It's never, it's supposed to be present. I'm supposed to be presenting you with the thing, but it's never there, so it doesn't arrive. You have all of that, deconstructive worry in the background there. And
Gotcha. Well, further questions, comments?
So, Donovan, I want to ask you, or just ask generally to everyone, if a kind of, again, speculative question. I wonder if what's called satori in Zen, these moments of breakthrough, can't be defined precisely as coming in touch with this precognitive awareness that Merleau-Ponty talks about.
I'm sympathetic. I'm myself sort of sympathetic. But if I put on the hats of different philosophers, I can see different objections as to why they wouldn't go in for that.
So what is that notion, just a little bit, for folks who might not be familiar with it that will watch this later?
The notion of like the insight.
Yes, in Zen that we're talking about.
Yeah. So it is definitely a certain sort of awareness of a detachment from your personal ego and a sense of ego loss to see the kind of connection of all things, especially through right now, the kind of infinite now that we all inhabit. So it's seeing sort of right then and there and recognizing this profound sense of interconnection and mutual identification and accessing your Buddha mind, as Dogen would say, which always lies latent, right? Zen would say this is always latent. So it has to be accessible somehow. But it would be, I think, the Buddha mind would have to be there as a kind of precognitive thing. And one of the things that obscures it is the layers of cognition, the aggregates, and the aggregation of our habits and our sense of identity and self and so on. I think the problem when you start to look at that from the position of any of these thinkers from the Continental canon is that it's going to be hard for them to admit that you're ever at a precognitive place and you can still reasonably call it an experience. because it's all, that is the problem that they, I think, inherit. I don't know if it's a problem. I'm not sure exactly yet how I feel about that, but they just inherit that from Kant. I think that there's always something suspicious about our experience of the world, and any experience that we have is subject to those potential doubts. And so I don't know that they would grant they would, I don't know that they would grant that that is an experience of something precognitive.
To bring that back to Merleau-Ponty, Spore, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but with this sort of latency in the Zen tradition that we just spoke of, relate to Merleau-Ponty's treatment of the cogito in action? What do you think?
That I'd have to think about.
That's what occurred to me when you said that.
Yeah, that I'd have to mull over, I think, a little bit more.
So the cogito for Merleau-Ponty in the Phenomenology of Perception it's distinct from Descartes' cogito, right? Which is, I think, therefore I am. It occurs not at the level of thought, but at the level of a kind of bodily self-awareness of oneself. He calls it a sort of reflection, which is not yet conceptual. It's not yet reflective at the level of thought. Now, it's quite confusing why he inserts the notion of the cogito into the Phenomenology of Perception, because there are so many other passages in that book which really hammer home the non-identity of oneself, one's inability to really achieve this kind of unmediated self-presence to oneself and self-presence to the world, right? So we are distributed throughout space and throughout time, right? And so we participate in being's self-differentiation through what he calls a partial coincidence. We coincide with the flux of being, the flow, but only partially, which is a strange concept, because what is it to partially coincide with something, right? He in his later thought, he uses the terms of overlapping, encroachment, transgression. And especially in The Visible and the Invisible, he returns to this notion of the tacit cogito, which he put forth in the Phenomenology of Perception. Now, I think he inserted it into the Phenomenology of Perception as a response to Sartre, Sartre's notion of like pre-reflective self-awareness, right, in being and nothingness, in which like at every moment that I am perceiving something, I have the capacity to become self-aware of myself. So I have to insert this pre-reflective self-awareness, right? When I'm perceiving, when I'm chasing after the bus, I'm aware of myself as chasing after the bus, or I can be aware of myself as chasing after the bus. But in The Visible and the Invisible, where he's really insistent on, I'm done with phenomenology, right? We have to find a totally new way to think of things. He returns to this idea of trying to get the body to kind of reflect on itself, and he uses this passage from Husserl about touching one's hand, right? The experience of your right hand touching your left hand, and how what happens in that is your body is simultaneously both active and passive, both in one sense a subject and an object, but it's also neither, because we're not at this conceptual division of the world into subject and object yet. It's pre-subjective and pre-objective. And he says that when your right hand is touching your left hand, there's what can happen is a reversible moment, right? Where the relationship between the two, the touching and the touched, the active and the passive, can reverse, so that you can feel that your right hand is touching your left hand, you can feel your right hand touched in turn by your left hand. And so your left hand becomes the toucher, and your right hand, which was active before, is now passive. But he insists on this, that they never coincide with each other, this touching and the touching and the touched. There's always what he calls an écart, or a gap, a separation, which prevents me from being identical with myself. And he says it is into this separation, this gap between me and myself, that the world inserts itself or enters. And so if we achieve an identity with ourselves at all, it is through the mediation of the world. We create what he calls a circuit with the world. Yeah. I'm not sure what, if anything, I can say about Satori.
Well, it seems for me that there do seem to be many parallels, but maybe the notion of immanency might be a point of differentiation. Of course, I don't know. I'm just off the top of my head. That's what seems to me. I don't know. What do you all think?
I think here, perhaps, just to make the distinction with Buddhism as clear as possible, the latency that you find in phenomenology, especially in Sartre, but I think also in Merleau-Ponty, is a latency for self awareness, which would be an awareness of self. Whereas in Buddhism, the thing that's latent in Buddha mind is exactly the awareness of no self.
Okay.
So it would depend upon in part upon what the content of this self-awareness would be once what was latent was made explicit.
Gotcha.
Because again, I think this is an appendix sort of. No, that's not right either, because that makes it seem less important. This is something that's coming about. Kant says that the I must be able to attend every thought. I must be able to add, I think, to whatever object of perception. It has to be there sort of as an immediate. So that bit of Kantian philosophy is being turned about in different ways relative to each of these thinkers' sort of systems, or whatever it is that they're building a bit.
Gotcha.
One, actually, I got to recommend too, a great Calvin O'Shrog wrote a book called Radical Reflection, and it has a lot to do with the role of pre-reflective consciousness and cognition in the continental tradition. And he talks a lot about not just Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, but also Dilthey, and Husserl. I mean, he's a great knower of Husserl, Kalshrog. He was part of that sort of, again, mid-century generation of American scholars that were bringing continental philosophy to the United States. So Cal ended up at Purdue with like Bill McBride and some of those founding SPEP figures. And Schrag was a bit. He studied with Gadamer in Germany and a bunch of different things. So he's a person, I think, who has a pretty deep understanding and an immediate access to the tradition, who wrote, I think, this really interesting book. He has a good book on the self, too, called The Self After Postmodernity.
Cool. I like that we're able to compare and contrast. I feel like this Chop Shop, more than others, we've really honed in on the specific differences and continuities between these thinkers. So thank you for bringing up that question, Louis. That's great. And I'm glad we had all of us here together as a team to kind of cipher through all that.
I just want to mention in regards to the question of point of view in something like Zen. So the greatest, to me, the greatest Japanese filmmaker is Yasuro Ozu, OZU, and he's long dead now, but he's also the most Zen, instilled with the Zen point of view. So what did Ozu do? He never moved the camera more than 3 feet from the floor. So that was not an attempt at some kind of, specious objectivity, nor was it an attempt at self. It was an attempt at, I don't know, plane of immanence or whatnot. I'd like to hear your reaction to that. And he achieved the most extraordinary spontaneous depictions of the relationship between, if you like, consciousness and the character through doing this.
You create a whole world through a perspective. I mean, it's kind of, I need to like think a little bit more or see, I think, some examples, but I can imagine like a commitment to a sort of perspective really creates the whole cinematic world and feel of it. I mean, I just have to think back to the Dogen, the fish in the water doesn't know that it's in water, and all of that, the question of perspectivalism within Zen. And so manipulating that perspective in film seems to be a pretty natural extension of Zen principles that would want us to take seriously sort of the interconnection of mind as it forms its pawns and golden palaces and all of that sort of thing. Because Zen art is kind of about perspective a lot. Like, it's something that comes from China, but the depictions of the natural landscape with the big, huge mountains and their, ink blotty and bleeding everywhere, and then like wee little tiny people in it, very pointedly, like the big sweep of nature, and humans are just this little thing in it. So I think that's an important role that perspective plays in art, that conveys a kind of symbolic order for, to the world. Always reminding us of the human, but also that it's just in perspective of the little part of the landscape.
But there's also this immense emptiness and
right.
lack of Western perspective.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what characterizes it.
Mm.
The use of empty space and time in a certain way in terms of the scroll or scroll-like paintings and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of perspective without perspective, but that doesn't mean anything. It's just another paradox.
Wu Wei. Yeah. Yeah. By fixing perspective, I eliminate a concern about perspective or something. I need to think. I would like to now see a couple of these.
But I would say, rather than like the immensity of nature or anything like that, which is kind of a concept that belongs to Western art.
Yeah. The intimacy that it creates, being that close and in on the floor.
Yes.
Yeah. This is good for me. I leave here with some homework and food for thought.
That's the best. That is the best type of conference or talk or philosophical discussion. So,
Yeah.
oh my goodness. And I hate to harp on this. I've had such a angsty week, but I'm just so grateful that the discussion ends on that note. Like, hey, we have a lot to think about and more to mull over. We're not going to sit here and posture and pretend like we know something and pull it out of our ass, because that's not true academic philosophy. So I want to thank everyone here for being wonderful examples of what academic philosophy actually is and what scholarship is. It doesn't necessarily mean publishing in a scholarly journal. It means embodying the spirit of academic philosophy and carefully tending these texts and having discussions and applying them to the real world and ourselves and these other thought systems. And, so, oh my goodness. Thank you, everyone, for being here. This is great.
And I do want to thank Spore again for coming, because I think, their presentation really showed in part what lawn chair philosophy is trying to do. So I just want to commend your, I know that like I get imposter syndrome and stuff still, and I have a PhD. So I know feeling like, oh, do I have a right to be in this space, or do I have a right to talk about Merleau-Ponty in an authoritative way? And I'm really glad that you did, because I thought it was an excellent presentation. And I think it's an important for everybody to see, and other people involved in the foundation to see, that, reading whatever it is seriously, even if it's by yourself, can really produce some profound results, and people know their stuff. So
and I
glad
think,
to be part of a space for all that.
yes, and as a message to those academics who are not as progressive and just up their own asses, hey, you don't need a degree. If you have the commitment and the passion, and the ability to question yourself and look further and further into the subject matter, you can become an expert. So goodness gracious, yes, thank you everyone in Spore, especially for, number one, helping us out at the last second, and being brave, and kid, you got it, you're going places, kid.
Thank you for having me, and yeah, it's been a pleasure and a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to thank Spore too. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I want to thank Spore too, because I think this presentation of Merleau-Ponty was a kind of linchpin for us today. So I really want to thank him for that. I also want to ask if anybody ever sees an Ozu film. I'd love to know your feedback on what you think. Tokyo Story or any of them, they're all amazing.
I have seen Tokyo Story. It's the only one that I've seen. I quite liked it. But after this conversation, I'm gonna go watch a couple more. So I'll report back if you wouldn't want me to.
I admit I have no idea what you're talking about. Tokyo Stories?
Tokyo. I mean, when I'm trying to going through my okay, Donovan, educate yourself and watch some classic films and world films, Tokyo Story is one that came up and that I watched. But it was a watch, amongst many. I didn't watch it for any particular reason, or I wasn't trying to note any particular thought. I just trying to be a more better versed in world cinema or whatever. But now I have some particular things to look for.
Yeah, no, Tokyo Story is quite something. But actually, late Ozu, an early Ozu of There Was a Father and Only Son is even a purer form.
Okay.
Existed before the transformation of Japanese culture.
Noted.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
No. Yeah. And thank you all. Any more closing comments before I give my little, ending announcement? Okay. Well, thank you all for joining, and those who are watching from home asynchronously, thank you for supporting us at the Launcher Philosophy Foundation. Stay tuned for another Chop Shop to come. We'll have our 6th installment, and otherwise, have a great time.